having said that, I want to be very straight with you tonight and say exactly what I think about this topic. Later, you'll have a chance to question my assessment, but let me say what I think about this topic. And what I see is this: both US and Chinese leaders are behaving in ways that are making a war between our countries ever more likely, and a kind of war that will be utterly catastrophic for both our countries. I don't think a war is inevitable, not yet, but it is becoming more so by the day. And because leaders of both sides think that a war is increasingly likely, they're making preparations for that war, and the preparations they're making are making war increasingly inevitable. Both sides view war with each other their greatest danger and their greatest and so preparation for war with each other is their highest priority, and they're pouring many hundreds of billions of dollars into the procurement of weapons and the deployment of weapons for a war with one another, and positioning their forces in the Pacific in a way that, as I will explain, increases the risk of a military clash that could escalate into war. And even if war doesn't erupt anytime soon, preparations for that war will poison domestic policy in this country for years to come, resulting in increasing anti-Asian hate violence and discrimination, as well as diminished funds for the domestic programs we all care about, for education, for health, and for climate change action. You're going to be hearing a lot about this in the months ahead as the new budget comes out next week on March 9th, and as members of Congress vie with one another to boost the defense budget to ever greater heights at the cost of domestic spending. Now, let me unpack this a little bit. Why do I think we're on a collision course towards war? The underlying reason, in my view, is that we have a clash of irreconcilable worldviews on the part of US and Chinese leaders, the people who actually make the decisions on war and peace. We're not included. The people who are listening in tonight are not part of those decision-making elites. But the elites are choosing to behave in ways that do make wars more likely. Chinese leaders, led by President Xi Jinping, seek to restore China's historic status as the dominant power in Asia and to secure a seat as an equal to the United States at the global rules-making tables. Now, we amongst us can discuss whether or not that's a legitimate aspiration for the world's #2 economy and the world's largest country by population. But our views really don't matter, because US elites, and when I talk about US foreign policy elites, I mean the leaders in the White House, in the CIA, in the Pentagon, and the top leadership in Congress, and the pundits, leading pundits in the think tanks in Washington, and the defense lobbyists. They together constitute a foreign policy elite, some people call it the blob, that makes decisions on US foreign policy. And this elite, this blob, this cabal unanimously believes that China must never be allowed to become the dominant power in Asia, but rather that the United States remain the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific region, and that China should never be allowed to have a seat as an equal to the United States at the world's rules-making tables. Indeed, they are united in their commitment to use whatever means necessary, economic, diplomatic, technological, or military, to keep China in a second-place status relative to the United States. This is now the dominant theme in U.S. foreign and military policy and is likely to remain so for the years to come. For Chinese leaders, of course, this is intolerable and unacceptable. They, in turn, are prepared to use any means necessary to ensure that China assumes its rightful place on the world stage by any means necessary. So to me, this is the underlying reason why I think war is becoming increasingly likely. But we have to consider two other complicating factors. First, domestic politics in the United States, and second, geographical and military considerations. First, on domestic politics. In the United States, we are seeing a contest between ambitious politicians of both parties to show who can be toughest in cutting trade with China, technological links with China, and to procure weapons to fight China, and most importantly, to convert Taiwan into a US military bastion to fight China. So they're vying with one another to who could lead in all of these efforts. All of the potential Republican candidates for president and other ambitious figures, like House Speaker Kevin McCarthy of California, have signaled that they will make toughness on China and aid for Taiwan a litmus test for party support, and that they will be campaigning on this issue. And so we're going to be hearing them, trying to out-tough each other in who could be strongest in their opposition to China and support for Taiwan. This means we will see legislation coming forward in the coming months that will make any scientific or technological contact with China essentially illegal in this country and put at risk thousands or more Chinese Americans and others who currently work at American universities and laboratories who might come under attack. And we're also going to see the erasure of 40 years of diplomacy between the US and China by converting Taiwan into a military ally of the United States in violation of all the pledges made to China by US leaders since 1979 to respect Taiwan as part of one China, part of the mainland, part of a one China, including Taiwan and the mainland. For Chinese officials, this is the point of no return. They've said over and over again that abrogation of the one China policy and conversion of Taiwan into a US military ally is a red line that cannot be crossed and will result in a conflagration. Will they carry through on this threat? This is where Chinese domestic politics enter the equation. President Xi is facing public discontent over his handling of the COVID crisis and over disappointing economic growth in the past few years. The loss of Taiwan to the US, as advocated by Congress, would be an enormous blow to his prestige, as US elites are well aware, and he may well feel obliged to invade Taiwan despite the risks involved. If Xi doesn't invade, his power and that of the Chinese Communist Party will surely be weakened. And this, no doubt, is the desire of US elites. So he is facing a very difficult choice in the months ahead. And you can appreciate how explosive this situation has become. So US elites see every reason to step up the pressure on China, even if the of provoking a conflict, and the pressure will be increased by the day in the months ahead. Now we come to the other complicating factor, and that is geography. The fact is that the US and China have overlapping spheres of defensive influence, or however you want to put it. The US leadership claims that America's forward defense line extends to the coast of China and includes the islands and the waters of the South China Sea and the East China Sea and Taiwan. And those include islands that are claimed by China, the Spratly Islands and the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, and of course, Taiwan. China, for its part, claims these waters as part of its national territory, and indeed believes that the islands are part of its sovereign territory, including Taiwan.
Several people have asked about the war in Ukraine. What are the effects of the war on Ukraine on the conflict between U.S. and China, do you think?
So that's a very good question. Like I say, China is the most hotly contested issue in America today, so we can expect folks who might try to intervene one way or the other. On Ukraine, first, let me say from the outlook of the U.S., from the blob, the foreign policy elites in Washington, Ukraine is a sideshow. The topic, the focus is Taiwan and China. So Ukraine is seen as the secondary theater, China the primary theater for them. And this is very clear when it came around just a few months ago, when the defense budget came up for final voting for this current fiscal year, when the Congress added $45 billion on top of the record budget that the administration submitted. And why did they add $45 billion? To have more ships and submarines and planes to fight China, not Ukraine. So their priorities are clear: China, China, China. And Ukraine is seen as a sideshow in the sense that Russia is viewed in Washington by the elite as an ally of China. And so the more that Russia can be battered and its military destroyed, the better. So the longer, the longer the fighting continues and the more Russian tanks destroyed, from that perspective, the worse China is, that hurts China. That's the outlook, I think, of the leadership in Washington.
Next question is, how do you see Japan's push for greater self-defense capabilities affecting the status quo between the United States and China in the South China Sea?
Japan's self-defense has to be equated with U.S. efforts to contain China. And so the U.S. is making Japan a partner in the contain China strategy. In return for the U.S. defending Japan, Japan is being prodded to help the U.S. defend Taiwan. So in the most recent statements from the Japanese leadership, they are now listing Taiwan as among their concerns, which they never did before. And the U.S. and the Japanese military are training together in ways that suggest that that Japan is being roped in to work with the U.S. to defend Taiwan in the event that China invades Taiwan. Somebody asked about Japan, will it increase its military and will it go nuclear? It is increasing its it's definitely increasing its defense budget, spending more on weapons. Will it go nuclear? Possibly, but not right away. It does have the capacity to go nuclear. It has a stockpile of plutonium. I don't think it'll go nuclear so long as the U.S. pledges to defend it with nuclear weapons.
The next question is, what role does India play?
India is being wooed by the United States to be part of the Contain China alliance system. The Biden administration has vastly increased the attention on what's called the Quad, which is the US, Japan, India, Australia alliance system. It's being described as a quasi-NATO or a proto-NATO, as a possibility of the nucleus of a future NATO for Asia. And there's a lot of military cooperation that goes on between within the Quad. There was a summit recently in Tokyo of the Quad members. There's a lot of military cooperation that's going on among those countries. So India is being sought by the US to join in this circling of China with hostile powers.
Several people have asked about the role of corporate interests in American policy towards China.
Well, the corporate universe was originally divided on policy towards China because there are many corporations that do business in China and wish to maintain access to the Chinese market. So the elites were divided until a year or two ago, these foreign policy elites, because as I say, some corporate interests didn't want to take a hostile stance. But that has largely evaporated because so many companies claim that China exploited American corporate participation in Chinese companies to steal technological information, to exploit their technological know-how to build up Chinese companies instead. So there's been a souring of support for trade with China, for economic interaction with China on the part of US corporations. And the number of companies that want to do business with China is diminishing. Moreover, first the Trump administration and now the Biden administration are taking steps to sever supply chain links between the US and China, especially of high technology gear. So US corporations, whatever their feelings are moving their operations away from China to other countries for fear of retaliation or sanctions. So they're being coerced. And there will be laws coming on the books. There are already laws that have been adopted, but there'll be more laws coming that'll make it harder and harder for US companies to operate in China.
Several people have asked about climate change and how that plays into this potential conflict, and whether there are opportunities for cooperation between the United States and China.
I thank people for that question because the fact that the U.S. and China are not cooperating means that our ability to prevent global warming from remaining below 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level have vanished, and all the efforts of all the good people around the world to stop climate warming, it's become futile now because the campaign against China has overtaken that. Without US-China cooperation on climate change, there cannot be a successful international drive to keep warming from exceeding 2 degrees Celsius. So I thank people for raising that, because I think in our efforts to prevent war with China, that making the argument that cooperation with China, diplomacy with China, is the only way, it is the only way we can keep climate change from reaching its most catastrophic effects. There is no other way. We must have cooperation with China, the 2 leading emitters of carbon, the 2 leading economies. Without US-China cooperation, there is no hope of keeping warming from reaching catastrophic levels. So this should be the centerpiece of our efforts to win public support for a diplomatic stance towards China. Thank you.
That leads into the next question, which is whether you can expand a bit more on what kind of policy the United States should be pursuing towards China.
Well, that's what I've been saying all along. We have very serious disputes with China, no question about them. Taiwan is the leading one, and then there are the issues of the South China Sea islands and human rights in China. And the Chinese have issues with us. They think our human rights policies aren't so good either, with reason. So there are genuine disputes, but these should be solved through diplomacy. And there's no reason why they cannot be addressed diplomatically. We also need to start arms control talks with China. Right now, there are no arms control negotiations, and both sides are increasing or enhancing their nuclear weapons capabilities. And this means that the risk, making the risk of a conflict becoming nuclear greater. So there's a very real need for what would be called nuclear stability talks between the US and China. That is, talks aimed at preventing misunderstanding or unintended conflicts producing nuclear escalation. There are a lot of very dangerous conditions that require kind of hotline agreements and the like to prevent escalation. So we need to have these kind of arms control talks.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your very important talk. It sounds like just a few of the takeaways are: it's on us. The grassroots must take responsibility with media outreach, political activism, more events to educate the public, write letters to editors, op-eds, arguing in favor of diplomacy on this issue. And that for more ideas, and maybe somebody will put this in the chat, visit the website saneuschinapolicy.org and include the argument when you're doing your activism. I believe Michael has suggested include the argument that we need cooperation on climate change and that we must start nuclear stability talks with China. This is vital.